There are forces in this life that remember what you no longer speak of. Not because you hold grudges, but because energy doesn't vanish, it evolves, waiting for alignment. And now, that alignment is here. The reckoning won't arrive with sound and fury, it will whisper through synchronicities that corner those who mistook your patience for absence. What's coming isn't revenge, it's restoration. The kind that rearranges timelines and closes accounts written in the ink of betrayal. This shift didn't begin with thunder. It started in silence, when you chose to act from intention instead of impulse. When you stopped responding to chaos and began radiating order. That moment, small as it seemed, sent signals to realms unseen. And those signals triggered a correction in the fabric of reality itself. You didn't just rise above what was sent to destroy you, you rewrote the meaning of it. There's a certain madness that enters the lives of those who try to distort light. Not immediately, but gradually, like the flickering of a faulty street lamp before it goes out for good. They once thought they could shape how the world saw you. But what they failed to grasp is that truth doesn't need defense, it just needs time. And that time has now arrived with precision so sharp it splits their narrative like a glass dropped on tile. You weren't meant to retaliate. You were meant to ascend. And ascension comes with its own form of judgment, one that doesn't scream, but reveals. One that doesn't strike with fists, but unfolds through divine orchestration. You didn't fight fire with fire. You became the storm that outlasted them all, not by force, but by vibration. They can't touch you now, not because you're hiding, but because you're operating in dimensions they no longer have access to. The beauty of this moment isn't in seeing them fall. It's in realizing you no longer need them to. Your elevation alone unsettles their foundation. Their plans didn't fail because they lacked effort, they failed because they misread the blueprint of your spirit. They thought they were playing games. What they didn't know was, you were fulfilling prophecy. Now, reality bends in your favor without effort. Doors unlock without knocking. And conversations about your name tremble into silence. Not because you demanded it, but because the energy surrounding you no longer allows falsehood to survive. You're not just protected. You've become untouchable in ways logic can't explain. The field around you corrects dishonor automatically. And as they scramble to understand how everything turned, you'll simply continue walking, unbothered, unshaken, divinely guided. Not to prove anything, but because there's no need. The universe is already speaking on your behalf. And its voice is louder than anything ever whispered against you. There's a kind of presence that doesn't blend in, it collides with illusions. The moment it enters a room, it rearranges the air itself. That's the kind of presence we're talking about. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply is, and in being, it forces masks to slip. To those hiding behind borrowed confidence, it's not just unsettling, it's threatening. They sensed a current they couldn't navigate and mistook it for weakness. Truth becomes dangerous when it refuses to shapeshift. While others contorted themselves to fit into spaces too small for the soul, this one stood tall in stillness. That refusal to bend for applause became a silent rebellion. And in the face of that unwavering stance, their own choices began to echo. The contrast wasn't loud, but it was loud enough to rattle the places where their shortcuts lived. They weren't ready to meet themselves in someone else's mirror. No committee forged this assignment. No hierarchy stamped approval on this light. It didn't rise from popularity, it rose from the unseen, from realms that don't measure worth by titles or followers. This isn't something that can be voted in or voted out. It exists without permission, anchored in truths that were here before social ladders were even built. And for those trying to dismantle what they never built, frustration was inevitable. When they launched their campaign, they weren't just challenging a person. They were poking at the scaffolding of reality itself. They packaged their discomfort as advice, camouflaged their envy as concern. Their words carried the scent of diplomacy but were lined with sandpaper. They called it feedback, but it was sabotage with polished edges. And through it all, the intention was clear, to shrink what made them feel small by comparison. But how do you shrink something that doesn't source its power from surface-level things? They underestimated what cannot be dethroned, because it never asked to be crowned. What stood before them wasn't stubbornness, it was sacred geometry in motion. Their tactics didn't dismantle the foundation, they only exposed the cracks in their own. And that exposure is where things began to shift. The more they pushed, the more reality pushed back. Not in chaos, but in correction. Their plans, designed like traps, began to misfire. What they set in motion returned, not out of vengeance, but as balance reclaiming its place. This wasn't punishment. This was the natural order restoring itself, using irony as its signature. Now, the quiet one they once dismissed walks with the rhythm of someone whose steps are guided by deeper codes. There's no bitterness, no need to retaliate. Just a calm certainty that what stands in truth cannot be moved by distortion. And the more they try to understand how things unraveled, the more they'll realize it wasn't the presence that disturbed them. It was the reflection. Some people speak just to hear themselves echo in someone else's discomfort. But this wasn't a performance you were ever going to audition for. Theatrics, tension, baited statements, none of it pulled you in. Instead of stepping into their spotlight of illusion, you disappeared into stillness. Not as retreat, but as strategy. Let them talk. Let them twist. Silence, in your world, wasn't absence, it was power kept under lock. They expected confusion. They got coherence. While they reshuffled their stories like cards marked with falsehood, your responses never wavered. Not once. Every word you spoke aligned with the last, making their contradictions obvious in ways they couldn't control. You weren't scrambling to protect a facade. You were simply rooted. And that rootedness turned every conversation into a quiet unveiling of everything they tried to hide. Their entire blueprint relied on you reacting. But instead of flinching, you leaned into your truth. You didn't dismantle their tactics. You made them obsolete. They brought games. You brought presence. They sculpted lies with surgical care. You lived out reality so clearly that their manipulation couldn't breathe next to it. They played chess with shadows. You sat in the sun and told the truth. They thought they had the crowd on their side. But what they gathered weren't supporters, they were mirrors reflecting their own wounds. You weren't trying to build numbers. You were attracting resonance. While they whispered warnings in circles you'd already outgrown, your energy was speaking louder than their voices ever could. Not because it screamed, but because it never needed a mask. Every time they cloaked cruelty as concern, your grace cut through it like light through tinted glass. The masks they wore didn't crack, they melted. And the ones who had ears to hear began noticing. What they called pride was your boundary. What they labeled aloofness was focus. They said you were too much, but you were just whole in a world that profits from pieces. The more they pushed, the more your silence created pressure they couldn't identify. It wasn't retreat. It was refinement. Their strategy needed noise to survive, but you starved it. While they flailed in their own theater, you turned the volume down on everything except alignment. You weren't playing the same game. You were building something they couldn't sabotage because it required no audience. And now, as their stories collapse under the weight of their own fiction, your calm remains. Not untouched by the chaos, but unclaimed by it. You didn't win by shouting louder. You won by listening deeper, to something they never even believed was real. And that's what changed everything. There are moments when people don't just lie about you, they turn your name into a warning label. Not because of who you are, but because of what you represent. To them, you became the scarecrow hung in the center of their garden of control, a symbol meant to keep others from wandering outside the system. They pointed to your silence and called it defiance. They pointed to your uniqueness and called it a threat. You weren't just mistreated, you were repurposed into a fable that served their fear. But every shadow they tried to cast became a contrast that made your light more visible. You held your ground, even when the ground shifted beneath you. And in doing so, you gave voice to the ones who had been watching quietly, those who hadn't yet found the strength to step away from the illusion. You didn't ask for followers. You became a spark. And sometimes all it takes is one spark to turn silent suffering into collective courage. While they rallied support like generals preparing for battle, you didn't even show up to the field. You weren't playing to win arguments, you were cultivating truth. They built towers out of gossip and disguise, but you laid stones in places that couldn't be reached by rumor. They mistook your calm for retreat. What they didn't realize was that you were planting something permanent while they were building with sand. Their tactics weren't just loud, they were deliberate. It wasn't the absence of kindness that made it hurt, it was the performance of it. The way rooms shifted when you entered. The way silence thickened when your name came up. But what they called rejection, you turned into redirection. Every eye that looked away helped you see clearer. Every closed door taught you what true welcome feels like. There's a strange power in being misunderstood, it refines you. While they mocked your pain and turned your collapse into conversation fodder, you were learning how to rebuild with your bare hands. Not just physically, but spiritually. You didn't carry shame, you carried sacred instructions. They danced around your grief like it was entertainment. But inside that silence, you were learning a new language, the sound of your own becoming. And when the storm came, they thought you'd drown in it. What they didn't know is that pressure doesn't just break, it separates. The ones who left were never truly with you. The ones who stayed weren't blind to the lies. And you, through it all, didn't chase clarity, you became it. You didn't need to be defended. Your consistency made their confusion louder than your words ever could. They documented your pain like it was a spectacle, collecting your losses like evidence. But you weren't collapsing, you were calibrating. What they labeled as endings were actually pivots. You didn't retaliate. You rebuilt. And the foundation you stand on now isn't made of approval, it's made of endurance. The kind of endurance that makes people wonder how you're still standing, until they realize you were never knocked down. Only rerouted. Some people don't just watch others fall, they record the collapse like a sport. Every misstep becomes a headline in their private theater. They didn't just notice your struggle, they archived it. With sneaky glances, secret captures, and covert whispers, they tried to immortalize your low points like souvenirs of someone else's undoing. It wasn't concern. It was consumption. Not empathy. Entertainment. They gathered not to support, but to dissect. Yet what they couldn't predict is that those dark hours became your furnace. You didn't hand them your spirit with your silence. You used their hunger for your humiliation as a mirror to reveal their hollow insides. Where they gathered to gloat, you quietly collected clarity. Every insult added to your momentum. Every smirk fueled your metamorphosis. They fed on mockery, but you were feeding something far greater, your rebirth. You didn't react. You rebuilt. You didn't throw fire back, you made art from the ashes. And the beauty of it all? They didn't see it coming. They braced for retaliation but watched you elevate instead. You found blessings in places they hoped would break you. You chose grace over games. Your healing arrived not as vengeance, but as evolution they couldn't sabotage. What disturbed them most wasn't your recovery, it was the fact that you still radiated despite everything. Your glow persisted where most would dim. And that presence, even in pain, was unbearable for those who needed you defeated to feel victorious. They whispered strategy while you embodied stillness. They tried to erase you, yet couldn't stand how you continued to matter. You saw the trap early. It was never about truth. It was about distraction. But instead of stepping into their arena, you built your own sanctuary. Their fear disguised as judgment didn't land because you weren't speaking their language anymore. While they kept begging the storm to sweep you away, you became the mountain it couldn't move. Their game didn't break you, it revealed you. You knew the rules of this world were never based on names, but on vibration. So you aligned yourself with frequencies too high for their malice to reach. While they cursed your journey in rooms you never entered, you were aligning with blessings they'd never recognize. Their obsession became a rope wrapped around themselves, tightening with every wish they threw against your peace. And now, they're sitting in the mess they crafted, still blaming shadows while your light continues to spread. You didn't just survive, you transcended. Their cruelty didn't steal your fire. It purified it. And the most poetic part? You never had to lift a finger to defend yourself. The universe took one look at their intentions and returned them home, gift-wrapped and undeniable. They watched the collapse of their own illusions and called it sorcery. When everything around them began to break, they didn't consider the weight of their intentions. They assumed you must have cast something dark to cause such precision in their downfall. But there was no spell book in your hands, only alignment. And alignment doesn't destroy things. It reveals what was never stable to begin with. Their confusion wasn't about your actions. It was about your frequency. Some of them began to murmur behind curtains, asking each other what invisible force you must have conjured. They told themselves you had some forbidden knowledge, some secret grip on unseen things. What they couldn't admit was that their ruin came from their own hands. Their schemes collapsed so efficiently, it felt like a curse, but all you had ever done was keep your integrity intact. They sabotaged themselves while watching you stand still. Every hostile wish they whispered into the ether didn't land where they aimed it. Instead, it circled back, drawn by the fingerprints of the one who released it. The universe doesn't operate on names or faces, it operates on resonance. And their energy, laced with venom, had only one place to go, the source. What returned to them wasn't karma's punishment. It was the echo of their own intentions, amplified. For some, manipulation wasn't enough. They chased answers in the shadows, looking for anything to silence your path. They reached for rituals with no understanding of what they invited. They paid for outcomes without reading the fine print of spiritual consequence. Desperate to derail you, they handed their will to people who promised results, but even those people warned them. And still, they persisted, hoping unseen forces would fix what their character couldn't. There were those who took it further. Not content with hired hands, they became the conjurers. With their own hands, they scribbled curses they barely believed in. They lit flames hoping to scorch your journey, unaware they were burning holes in their own. Portals were opened. Forces were stirred. And now, what entered won't leave. They tampered with realms that don't forget, and now the silence in their homes sounds louder than thunder. They mistook darkness for an ally. But darkness is never loyal. It doesn't serve commands, it seeks cracks. And when it found theirs, it stayed. What they thought would be a one-time transaction became a permanent presence. There are no more quiet nights. No more restful sleep. The fear they tried to send to you has become their companion, sitting with them in every shadow, whispering back what they once wished on you. And through all this, you remained untouched. Not because you fought back, but because you never engaged. Your light wasn't louder. It was cleaner. You weren't protected by superstition, but by clarity. While they entangled themselves in energies they couldn't command, you aligned with peace that couldn't be disturbed. And now, the contrast is undeniable. You're rising, and they're haunted by the very storm they summoned. Some people don't just invite chaos, they roll out red carpets for it. They danced with energies they thought they could control, and now those same forces sit in their living rooms, uninvited but unmoving. The air feels dense. Sleep is fractured. Conversations end in cold silence. Nothing feels stable anymore, because the storm wasn't cast on them, it was conjured by them. And now it clings to their routines, refusing to leave what it was once summoned into. What broke them wasn't your presence. It was your absence, and what followed after. They thought clearing you out would clear their path. But instead of doors swinging open, everything around them shut tight. Their efforts didn't produce progress. They produced exhaustion. Their resources dried up. Momentum vanished. What once flowed with ease now grinds like rusted gears. And the irony? The moment they tried to block your light, their own began to flicker. They tied their success to your silence, and that was their undoing. Every step they took was stitched to a thread of resentment. They didn't want to shine on their own. They wanted to rise on your ruin. But when the foundation is built from bitterness, even the prettiest structures eventually fracture. People began to sense it. Not in facts or proofs, but in feeling. A subtle discomfort. A lack of resonance. And that invisible shift became impossible to unsee. What they once felt as power now echoes as emptiness. They tried to rewrite a destiny that wasn't theirs to shape. And when it didn't respond to their hands, they blamed the silence. But this wasn't absence. It was disconnection. When you attempt to redirect someone else's divine momentum, you lose your own compass. And they're lost now, still speaking affirmations into voids that no longer respond, still calling for favor that refuses to answer. This isn't some spiritual timeout. It's a door that's been sealed. They stepped past the line where restoration lives. Their downfall isn't punishment, it's recalibration. They weren't removed. They removed themselves. They tampered with sacred flow and now sit in the dry spaces they created. The emptiness isn't temporary. It's reflective. The silence isn't stillness. It's distance from the very grace they once manipulated. But time, always time, it clears the fog. Patterns become visible. The one who blamed you now argues with everyone. The person who called you unstable leaves fragments wherever they go. The mask begins to slide. The applause they once earned becomes quieter. People start to observe the inconsistencies. No one needs to investigate, the story unravels all by itself. And through it all, you remain steady. Not loud. Not defensive. Just true. You didn't prove anything, you became the proof. While they danced in distortion, you walked in clarity. While they wove complexity, you offered simplicity. And that contrast? It spoke louder than any argument. It wasn't your voice that convinced the world. It was your vibration. And it never lied. Every interaction leaves an echo. And some echoes never stop bouncing. What they tried to erase is reappearing in fragments, through memories, through conversations, through the way people now feel when certain names are mentioned. The narrative they worked so hard to cement is fracturing, not because someone exposed it, but because time did. People are picking up threads they once ignored and finding that they've been woven into a pattern of manipulation they never consented to. Those who once stood on the wrong side of the truth aren't just uncomfortable, they're unraveling. The realization hits differently when you see that you weren't just misinformed, you were mobilized. Not out of loyalty, but out of ignorance. And now that clarity is returning, guilt creeps in. Not the guilt of action, but of complicity. The lies are coming full circle, cutting the very hands that passed them forward. And as recognition blooms, more and more begin to step back and say, wait, something doesn't add up. What they never understood is that you weren't silent because you were scared, you were silent because you were awake. While they flailed, you refined. While they plotted, you listened. You didn't interrupt the noise, you simply chose not to echo it. And that stillness, that refusal to fight on their level, confused them. They thought you disappeared. But in truth, you just moved away from their chaos and closer to your calling. They couldn't comprehend restraint because their version of strength only knows how to push. But real power? It doesn't need to shove. It doesn't chase applause or beg to be believed. You knew that rising didn't require revenge, only readiness. And so you waited. Not in weakness, but in wisdom. Letting them show themselves fully before you revealed who you were becoming in the background. Now that you've stepped into alignment, your presence unsettles everything they constructed. The calm in your eyes, the glow in your path, the momentum that keeps building, it disorients them. You're the living contradiction to their entire strategy. You succeeded without their permission. You healed without their apology. And every win you experience reminds them of every lie they told. But the most powerful thing is this: you didn't just recover, you expanded. You didn't just rise, you multiplied. Doors are opening that were never part of their plan. Rooms are welcoming you that they tried to shut forever. And no matter how much they once distorted your image, the world is now seeing you clearly. The sabotage didn't stop your story, it sharpened your signature. Because through it all, your truth stayed intact. And now, it's louder than ever, not in volume, but in vibration. Their strategy dissolved under its own weight. Your endurance became revelation. And your legacy? It's being written not by the ones who spoke the loudest, but by the one who stayed real the longest. When sacred bonds are broken for selfish gain, the cost isn't just relational, it's existential. Some people didn't just walk away from what was meant to elevate them, they tore through a connection designed to unlock their next evolution. And in doing so, they didn't just lose someone, they lost the mirror that would have shown them their own divine potential. Now, nothing fits quite right. Rest escapes them. Thoughts feel fogged. Motivation slips through their hands. The invisible weight isn't psychological, it's spiritual misalignment dragging every part of their life off balance. They didn't simply break your trust, they disrupted their own capacity to connect from a place of wholeness. Their betrayal wasn't just a theft of loyalty, it drained their soul of something far more valuable: integrity. The more they tried to destroy your image, the more fragmented their own reflection became. And what they experience now isn't sadness, it's a hollowed-out state where joy doesn't echo anymore. Achievements fall flat. Relationships lack warmth. Every handshake feels like strategy. The hollowness isn't burnout. It's what happens when you cash in your spirit for clout. They didn't just want to push you aside, they wanted to rewrite the narrative entirely. Their tactics were subtle, their timing calculated, their masks convincing. But under every false smile was a blueprint for removal. Not just from the room, but from remembrance. They weren't trying to disagree with you. They were trying to erase you. But divine purpose isn't erasable. It doesn't bend to whispers. It doesn't disappear when ignored. It expands in silence. And now the great reversal unfolds like a curtain torn from top to bottom. The roles have shifted. Voices once booming now barely murmur. You, who they thought would fade quietly, are stepping into moments tailor-made for the version of you they never saw coming. Their networks are shrinking. Their voices losing weight. And your path? It glows with something untouchable, something not born of status, but forged through divine timing.